ideas. I've had to do, let's see, 180? Oh, I'll have to do it. Well, I mean, sorry. Oh, yeah. Today's our last in person. I just realized something. Although I knew it, I had not been thinking about it. Maybe it's because I hate vegan. This is our last in-person class. Okay, I'm not alone. It's our last in-person. We obviously have blended on Thursday, and it's starting next week. We're completely on Zoom. The final 2 weeks. That's pretty crazy. Yeah. You know, I said at the beginning of the semester it was going to fly by, and I mean, to a degree, it kind of has, but at the same time, we still have 3 more weeks technically. This week is barely begun, but it kind of has flown by, but it also has felt like a really solid pace. So it's just weird, though. We're almost at the end of the semester, and we're almost at the end of COVID. It looks like. So next time we see each other, you'll just be passing me by, going, "Oh, what's his name again?" Don't worry, I'll be doing the same thing. But yeah, no, it's kind of crazy. So the next time, like, we have class live, it won't be in person, but you'll also have the other half of your class you've not seen for the last 8 weeks, 10, 12 weeks, however long it's been. So anyway, so with that, we also start the Civil War. The Civil War will be our final topic that we discuss. I love this subject. I will tell you that when I was in high school, if I didn't say this thing in semester, forgotten it, I hated history. History was my least favorite subject. I would much rather go to a math class when I was in high school. In fact, I much preferred it. My math teachers were fantastic. Looking back on it, seeing how much I ended up really enjoying history, I realized that my history teachers just sucked. I mean, they were bad. They were really bad. And my math teachers, even though math is a subject I'm terrible in, my math teachers are obviously far more engaging. And so the Civil War then was my least favorite subject to learn about through high school, through junior high and high school and stuff. But again, I mean, it never spoke to me. So the older I got, though, the more interested I got in history. And then when I went and got my master's degree in history, I made a point to take a Civil War class because I was like, well, if I'm going to be teaching history, learning history, making this a career, like I really should kind of understand the thing that I disliked the most. Ended up really enjoying it, and which again kind of brought me back to, wow, my history teachers really sucked. So I really enjoy the subject, this topic. It still isn't my favorite. The Revolutionary War is my favorite. If we're going to talk about, favorite wars kind of thing. That's my favorite war, favorite era to discuss. I have other eras in American history that I still find more fascinating. But the Civil War is a very, very interesting subject, and I've worked really hard in the last few years to make this series as interesting as I possibly can, and I feel very confident I've succeeded. I love teaching this. My students always walk out of this going, okay, that was pretty cool. I have a story that I tell at the end of the semester that I did at the very last class with this, where I have had students cry. I mean, that's part of my goal, is not to make you cry, but just to make you feel some emotion. I mean, I think buying into it a little bit more, you kind of feel a little bit more a part of the history when you feel an emotion, whether it's interest or happiness or sadness or anger or whatever. So like I'm not introducing this to be like, oh, I'm sorry, this really sucks. No, I don't. It doesn't. I have a lot of fun teaching this. I work on these lectures every single time I teach them, and I improve them every single time. I add more to them in terms of presentation style and so forth. And so, like, this one is the best yet. So this whole series coming up will be the best yet. So anyway, I'm stoked that this is our last subject. It just sucks that this is our last subject. That this is our last class in person. I really thoroughly enjoyed this class. I really thoroughly enjoyed you guys. and love the conversations that we have. I wish that we could have had, because I really like the other half of your class, and I just wish we could have had the two halves together. So we'll get that for 3 or 4 more classes on Zoom, which, by the way, leads us into a little bit of housekeeping. We have one final assignment, which is on the Civil War. It's a pretty easy assignment, I believe. And we also have an assignment deadline of those dates. Oh, ignore the dates. I totally forgot to fix those. Those dates are incorrect, but we've got a little deadline messing with, some change around some kind of time to discuss with you. So the assignment is very simple. It's another worksheet. It's on iPod. It's a doc file which you can download as of now. And all I have to do is answer 4 questions, approximately 250 to 300 words each. That's it. I mean, we're still talking essay texts. That's all these are, 4 essay texts. One is explain the causes of the American Civil War, which we're going to discuss a lot today. 2, describe the course of the war from 1861 to 1865. You got to just discuss, the battles. That one tends to be a little bit longer. I'm going to be straightforward. That one tends to be a little bit longer, but they're not writing huge things. 3, discuss how the events of the Civil War contributed, or the events of the war, contributed to emancipation. And 4, explain how this war contributed to the creation of an American identity. What about the war changed who we are as a country? So 4 very straightforward questions. Number 1, you can answer at the end of today. And I want you to start thinking of these questions as I can kind of answer each of these at the end of each class, because I want to mess with the data a little. So here's some references. I've got this in. So our last day of class is the 18th. There's the former last day of class, and it is the last day that the university has for you to turn in any assignment. But technically, the assignment turn-in date is the 18th. This is the date that you'll find a lot of class. I would like you to turn it in on the 13th. Now, that is still 2 full weeks, so it's not like I'm cutting any time away from you. But there's a very specific reason why I do that. This is really the last, these 2 times, but this time is the last time I will see any of you. And I like to have this graded and returned in, by this date. So that way, in the event that you make a big mistake, that you do something poorly, yada, 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 I can still reassign it to you. You can still fix it. You can still get points. You can still bump your grade up. Because if you wait till this last second, the moment Loud Cloud recognizes that it was midnight on, April 19th, you cannot submit anything. There are no extensions. There's no opportunities. Loud Cloud is locked. So, and that also means that if you try to turn something in at 12:01 on the 19th, and I will say this right now, and I will say this 4 times, you'll get this exact same spiel over video on Thursday, and then over Zoom on next Tuesday, next Thursday, because I'm that serious about what I'm explaining to you. Every single semester, I have no fewer than 3, and sometimes as many as 5 students will shoot me texts at like 12 o'clock, 12:10, 12:31. Can you reopen it? I can't turn it in. And the answer is unequivocally no, you screwed up, it is over. You get a 0. I can't reopen this. It is impossible. It is locked. Plus, you've had 3 weeks to answer 4 questions. And I asked you haven't turned in on the 13th. So that way, if you did make a mistake, you had an additional 5 days to fix it. So what I'm asking you to do right now is start thinking, I got 2 weeks to answer 4 questions. Start seeing if you can start piecing this together, and then have it done. And I'm going to bug you to have this thing turned on the 13th. The other thing, too, is on the 13th, what I will do is, even though it is over Zoom, I'll pull it into a private chat. I will grade the assignment right there in front of you. You will then get a full and complete grade for the entire semester that moment. And the second you log off, you're done. You'll know that your precise semester score in this class by the 13th. I guarantee it. By the time we're done with our 1 o'clock class on the 13th over Zoom, you will know exactly what your grade is. And that's it. And you're finished. I can't give it to you unless you turn it in. But if you do turn it in, you will get your grade right then and there for that assignment in the entire semester. And you're done. Make sense? So I will end whole class on the 15th. but those are generally very, very small. And what I'll do is I'll basically, I'll do something for those students who want to come on and chat. But the assignment due date is the 13th. Make sense? All right. So very quickly recap. Final day of the semester is the 18th. Turn the assignment on the 13th. That's 2 weeks to answer 4 questions that you can start answering today. After this class, you'll have a lot of information, enough information to start putting together the answer to the first question. And it can be pretty much done. I mean, you can't finish it. You flip through the textbook and whatever and just fill in a little more information. Voila, you are complete. And now, you still have 2 full weeks to only answer 3 questions. Make sense? Okay. What day are you turning in your assignment? Thank you. That's all I ask. Now, here's the other thing, too. You probably have 2, 3, 4 other classes, and they all have relatively the same due date. Imagine being done with this class complete, walk away, know your grade, everything, and still have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days to now focus entirely on those other classes and those final assignments. So I'm also buying time to focus on everything else, but just getting my simple assignment in first. Cool? You're going to hear the spiel 3 more times because that dead set on it. If you do it right, you're going to do well. And just remember, if you wait, I can't help you. If you get it on the 13th, I 100% can and am eager to help you to get the most points possible. Cool? Let's talk about the Civil War. All right, so today we're going to describe it. By the way, this goes for all of you on all 4 of you on this class is better. Today we're describe the importance of the Civil War on the 19th century Earth. So first we have to define what is Civil War. Why is it a Civil War? Why is it another war? Why is it whatever? Okay. A Civil War is very simple. The definition is very simple. It holds a couple parts, but they're very easy to kind of grasp on. So a Civil War is a contested incompatibility, meaning the 2 sides must be, must obviously have some differences within one another, which concerns types of political systems. So there must be a minimum of 2, but it's generally just 2 political bodies who have an incompatibility. There's something between them that is leading to aggression. Where the use of force, that's the aggression aspect, where the use of armed force between 2 parties, of which at least one is the government or state, and the result must be at least 1,000 battle-related deaths a year. So you must have 2 political systems, 2 entities, one of which must be the centralized government or state, and once aggression begins, there must be at least 1,000 deaths per year. It's very straightforward, very simple. And there are some variances as to what is a little bit more, what is a little bit less. So when an identifiable rebel organization challenges the government militarily, and the resulting is more than 1,000 combat-related deaths, with at least 5% on either side. So they're 5% of the government and their military, because technically all soldiers, whether in the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Space Force, 5% of them must die, along with at least 5% of the rebel, totaling 1,000 deaths per year. This all makes sense. So then, if groups are fighting each other, just because groups are fighting each other, this does not constitute a civil war. Then it is communal violence, i.e. rival gangs. Why? Rival gangs can have a political structure, but why don't they count as a civil war? Because not one of them is the centralized federal authority or state. That entity has to be involved. Rebellious groups must be able to further inflict fatalities on the government side. Otherwise, the violence is classed as a massacre or genocide. So that's why if people are fighting their government, but the people, the rebels, aren't able to inflict any deaths on the government side, but the government is able to inflict deaths on the civilian side, then that is massacre or genocide. Massacre usually be like 1 or 2 instances It can certainly be well more than 1,000 deaths. And genocides that are usually long term, where the government starts to meticulously wipe out a certain group of people. A simple reference to that would be Hitler and the Jews. It was a systematic, we could say that the Jews were fighting back, and on occasion they would. They were hardly ever able to inflict any damage on Nazi Germany and their military and soldiers and so forth. So therefore, they could never reach 5% deaths on the military side. Thus, since the government, since Hitler's Nazis were inflicting so much consistent death, the intent of wiping out that group of people, then they would have genocide. It would have been kind of a one-time message, a one-time event, something like we see in the Middle East on occasion, in which a gas bomb goes off and wipes out an entire town. You know, it's a couple thousand people dead in one shot, but then there are no subsequent events. That's a massacre. It's a one-time event. Capiche? Does that all make sense? So again, it's pretty straightforward. That's why the American Civil War is what it is. The Union, Lincoln's Army, the United States Army, Union deaths equal far more than 1,000 per year and far more than 5% of the total death count. So that's the other thing too, that 5% number. It just means if all deaths constitute 100%, there has to be more than 5% on either side. And for the United States and the Union, the United States and the Confederacy, it was closer to 50% on either side. So thus, we fall into Civil War definition. Let's tell a little bit of, a little bit of fun, people. What say you? The United States is very divided right now. Unlike, though, the Civil War, in which those divisions were very sectional and regional, the Southern South, regional group, versus basically the rest of the country, but certainly that Northern Union group. So the battle lines in the American Civil War were therefore straightforward. The two sides were therefore very easily recognizable and separated clearly. If, and I literally mean if, it's not in any way saying we're on the verge of Civil War, because we're not. But for the sake of argument, to just kind of bring that emotion of the past into today, if there was a reason for the United States to go to North and South today, how might it divide itself along those lines? Social distance talking neighbors. How do you say that?
What do you think is on? But I could see something like big cities. I think it's interesting, yeah.
Oh, obviously this is entirely speculative, so it's just fun to kind of discuss and see what we might come up. Joella? John? Okay, that's a simple, yeah, Republicans versus Democrats. But how might the battle lines be drawn? Like how do we group together in any way? So it'd be fought kind of house to house kind of thing, street to street. All right. Ashley?
Yeah. We were trying to figure that out too. I think we ended up coming up with like, it'll probably be like neighbor versus neighbor, if that's it to that point, but probably like major cities will declare what state is what.
We'll declare what?
What state is like red or blue.
Oh, okay.
It goes from there. Or like East Coast versus West Coast.
Well, I mean, it could be East Coast, although the East Coast and the West Coast seem to be very politically aligned. So it might be East Coast, West Coast versus everybody in the middle. Yeah. And then even for, I mean, how many of you guys are from like Washington, Oregon? So, I mean, isn't it like coastal blue and then central? I mean, so it's even like, it's just seriously the coastlines kind of. I only know that based on what you guys have said. I've never been to either state. Jesse, what did you guys talk about? Oh, okay, so it's the East. Yeah. You know, I will say that people on the East do think that people on the West are very soft. That East Coast people feel very tough, and West Coast people, and believe that West Coast people are soft. I don't know what West Coast people feel about themselves and what they think. And when I say coast, I do mean primarily California. What they feel like towards the East Coast. Are there any Californians in here that have like a strong opinion on New York?
No, we literally don't care.
You literally don't care? You don't exist in my book.
There's too much story about California.
We have other issues than the word about New York. So New York has got it. Well, they've had a lot of time to think. They're still in lockdown. I mean, they were told, go to your room, so they still haven't been allowed out for the last year. Well, yeah, I mean, I know that California's been closed, and this is a total sidebar. I went to San Diego over New Year's break, and I mean, we went to the beaches. Everything was open. Like, you could even sit in restaurants. So I wasn't exactly sure what exactly was closed. Now, I know it was San Diego versus, like, LA. But yeah, I mean, I had to wear a mask, but, we were on the beach, so nobody was wearing masks.
It's also a good portion of time where, like, everything opened for, like, 2 weeks, and then they shut back down.
Yeah, I know that. Yeah, I remember doing that, but yeah. All I know is that's where I got COVID, so. There I was thinking, okay, well, this feels pretty good, and then boom, I'm sick. Kenna?
We said pretty much the same things as everybody else. Liberal versus
Republican.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah.
Maybe
Coastal.
Maybe Texas versus everybody else.
Maybe Texas versus. Did Texas have nukes? I mean, that would be that's their way of like, taking control of the conversation somehow. Like I said, it's just kind of a fun thing, just a place where they were in modern times. So, okay. In terms of Confederate myths, in terms of those things that they were claiming at the time, so do you guys recall what antebellum means? We did discuss this a while back. Before war. So the antebellum South, the before war South, One of the myths that they had was, one of the things that they believed about themselves were that essentially they were the land of gold, they were a golden land of milk and honey, and that everybody was happy and content. And at the North, they were the aggressors. They launched this unjustified attack on the South in misguided efforts to subjugate this region. And then from 1831 to 1865, through the end of the war, Southerners were simply just trying to defend their air quote rights of constitutional government. Anyone want to call BS? The population, so to say, the South is the land of milk and honey, which all are happy and content, precludes that we also ignore that one problem that 75% of the population was facing, which is called, the word is slavery. Yeah, we're doing great. Don't look behind that, but behind me, where I've got 200 slaves chained up, tilling the fields. These were human beings that they were dealing with. And it was human beings that the North and Lincoln were trying to free. By the way, he honestly didn't do a good enough job because you guys, I think we discussed a couple weeks ago, a month ago or so, that school, elementary school in San Francisco is changed the name. They were Abraham Lincoln High School or elementary school, whatever it was, and they're not changing it to something else because Lincoln was actually a really bad racist who didn't do anything for slaves, for blacks. Like, they never opened a textbook. Further, when the North elected a president, he was hostile to their rights. This is what they said, that Lincoln was hostile to the rights of the South. And thus the South pushed him to a corner to resort with secession, which was also, they believed, a clear constitutional right. They had a right to secede. We're still waiting for the legal argument for secession. We'll get it, it'll come. Most of them referenced, or most of the arguments were referenced to a letter. Thomas Jefferson had a habit of saying things in letters that people took biblical. One was his reference to a separation of church and state. He was simply saying that the state would not enforce a religion on anybody. He did not say to take religion out of government, that people shouldn't be religious, that we shouldn't follow Christian, Judeo-Christian values, but whatever. Now we've got a wall. We're not allowed to be religious. And then he also said that, again in the letter, he said, that there could be some movement or some idea about secession that, I should have put the quote, but to just kind of paraphrase, that there could be something that if the government is to oppress it, the states have the right to do something. And so they took that biblical, they took that very, very literally. And in essence, he is correct. I mean, Machiavelli, which is one of the great political thinkers, we discussed in world history, one of the great political thinkers of the Enlightenment, who did say, like, when government's wrong, you got to overthrow them. And this was something Thomas Jefferson did, then paraphrase the Declaration of Independence. But when it came to the constitutional aspect, there was nothing in the Constitution that says, yeah, a state can secede. In fact, the Constitution actually says that when the state is added, they are in perpetuity, which means forever. You're not allowed to leave. You are now a state in the United States. Welcome home. There's no going back, kind of thing. Lincoln essentially put an end to the argument of can a state secede? Brought them back, they can't. Essentially now, if a state does want to secede, that argument, I do think there has to be an openness to the idea of secession because, and I'm totally sidebarring here, but if a government is truly oppressive, you have to have some sort of reasonable right of refrain. You've got to be able to fight back. But basically, it doesn't mean secession. It means total government overthrow. You got to just start over. And that is what Machiavelli said. And that is what Jefferson wrote in the Declaration. That is what he was referencing in his letters. He never said secede. He said, no, you just got to overthrow it. That's a whole other argument for the time. So further, the South said that the Lincoln administration used military force to hold the South in the Union. For 4 years, Lincoln waged a brutal, unconstitutional war in the South. Some of that could be honest, goodness true. But during the war, all Southerners supported the Confederacy. No, not accurate. Again, I mean, you got the blacks, the slaves, who are like, yeah, I think I prefer what the Unionists are offering to freedom. But then you also did have Southerners who, weren't necessarily all for the Confederacy, especially after it starts failing, which we'll get to here today. And then they also said it was the North's overwhelming numbers of resources that wore down brave Southerners. Sort of. There was also the industrial side of it, we discussed in terms of railroads in the past, but it's also military blunders. There's some good luck. And there's also Grant who just said, I'm just taking you out. We're not going to stop. I'm not going to stop until you capitulate, until you lose. And that ended up being his strategy, and it's working. So, in terms of the lead up to the war, these are just kind of key phrases. If you're writing this down, let me just plot it. So, some of the significant events, the concepts of it. Obviously, colonization led to the formation of the United States. If you recall, during your colonization history, that the North and the Middle, we studied in high school the northern colonies, the middle colonies, the southern colonies. There were differences. We had the Missouri Compromise, which added Missouri into the Union as a slave state. It was above the line where they weren't supposed to add slave states. We had a very popular abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator. We had the arguments of nullification and secession, even with Andrew Jackson in the 1830s. We had the Mexican-American War, which added new territory in Arizona. We had the Wilmot Proviso, which was an unsuccessful bill to ban slaves, or ban slavery in the territories acquired from Mexican-American War, including Arizona. We had the Compromise of 1850, which helped diffuse that issue of slavery by offering the option of voting on the idea of slavery, the popular sovereignty, which then led to Bleeding Kansas, which we discussed, and Bleeding Sumter. We had the Dred Scott case, which we discussed, with the fugitive slave laws, Harper's Ferry, and then ultimately the election of 1860. Every one of those played a role. They were all part, all a piece of the puzzle that would ultimately end up being the war. And of course, the big one is Lincoln's election. Had a Democrat been elected, we probably don't have war, because the Democrat Party at that time was very much just let the South be, let them continue slavery, let's just continue to work this out. We'll kick the can down the road is kind of political phrase. How do let's not deal with it today, let's kick that can down the road, let's kick that issue down the road, let the future Congress deal with it. Well, Democrats are in the habit of doing it. Let's not deal with it, let's just capitulate, let's let slavery continue, let's let slavery continue, let's let slavery continue. And the Republican Party, which had formed with the idea of finally ending slavery, was the one who's been on with the elected leader, Abraham Lincoln. So when it's like, no, we're not going to kick down the can down the road, we're going to deal with this now. He did not want war. He did not enter his presidency with emancipation as his number one issue. He did not enter his presidency with the 13th Amendment that of making slavery an unconstitutional act as a primary issue. But his issue was, let's face this head on, figure it out. War ended up allowing him emancipation as a political move, as a military strategic move, and then allowing him to get the 13th Amendment passed. If you ever saw the movie Lincoln with Daniel Day-Lewis, they explained how it allowed him to get that amendment passed without the Southern states. It might have been possible that the Southern states were in the Union, but then out, he was able to get it through. And then boom, the Southern states came back and were like, we didn't vote on the 13th Amendment. Too bad, you're coming back to a nation that has changed while you were gone. And part of that change is the ending of slavery. So that was Lincoln. That would have never happened with the Democrat president, because we'll get into it in a second. The president was a Democrat, and all he did was kick that can down the road. And he basically said, all right, Lincoln, here's a mess, clean it up, and that includes war. And he did it. There were plenty of abolitionist activities. We discussed a few in terms of John Brown in the past. Plenty of incendiary literature, including The Liberator, which is a big time, again, an abolitionist newspaper. We had the Southern split finally come to Carolina Convention. We'll discuss that here in a moment. We obviously had a Northern anti-slavery president, although he wasn't enough to keep the school named after him in San Francisco, so what are you going to do? Lincoln posed a threat to the patron's office. Those offices in the House and the Senate, which were just consistently held by slave-owning white guys, he posed a threat to them, because if he ends slavery, they lose power. He had veto power over new legislation to protect slavery, which would have required 2/3 vote to overturn a veto, which was never going to come in either House or Senate. And he was further able to propose new legislation and Republican backing propose legislation to end slavery, he would sign, which does then hurts that slave-owning Southern Democrat power. And he also finally believed that their way of life was immoral. He had, they paint Lincoln as this really great emancipationist and civil rights activist and equal rights activist. No, he was still a man of his time. He was just, he understood, and when I say that, he had racist tendencies, or at least what we perceive as racist tendencies. Things that back then seemed still quite normal. And that includes, he didn't quite believe that whites and blacks could live together in a community. He didn't quite believe that blacks were adequate mentally enough to be able to take on many of the major roles that adults need to fill in society. However, to defend him on that, he was ignorant, and ignorant doesn't mean stupid, it just means uneducated. He was ignorant, but based on societal cause. You never really saw blacks working in major industry. You never really saw blacks holding political office. You never really saw blacks doing these things that any human being can do. And thus, he was a product, his intuition was in many ways the product of the scenery around him. Since they weren't allowed for many races to do a lot of these things, he kind of held on to being, well, maybe we can do it together. What he did realize on a fundamental level, he accepted and promoted, was the human being aspect. These are human beings, so whether or not they can keep up with some of the things residents do, they're still human beings and must be treated as such. And he quotes the Bible time and time again in his argument, so it's not as if he's coming at this willy-nilly. He's seeing Jesus Christ speak on these issues, but well, Christ says it this way and it shouldn't be followed. Lincoln was a very good man. He had his issues, but I just argue they're a product of his time. If he were to rise up today, he would be as equal rights and civil rights kind of forward as any of us could be in terms of the equality of all mankind. In terms of the secessionist pop case, the strategy by the South was states' rights. I discussed this again a few weeks ago in regards to the South, was always for states' rights until the federal government worked in their favor, and they were very, very much pro-federal central government. They wanted to leave before there could be a transgression of preemptive strike by a Lincoln-led administration that could prevent them from doing more. So that could be Lincoln signing a bill that ends slavery on some level. And so they wanted to get out so that way they could solidify their foundational core beliefs on that. Some of the more reluctant states would solidify over time. Remember, it took time for these states to fall in line. Because some emotional responses got better results. So think on this as coronavirus. You guys remember 1 year ago, let's use Dr. Fauci as an example. 1 year ago, Fauci said, masks are stupid, he didn't use the word stupid, he said they're unnecessary, they're irrelevant. He literally said in an interview, it's like, people touch them, we don't know how to prepare them correctly, we don't know how to keep them clean, because it's just going to do more harm if they're not necessary. Then over time it goes, no, we need masks. Everybody must mask. Now everyone must wear 2 masks. And soon it's going to be, now you must suffocate, because if you're dead, you can't contract it anymore, so it can't get knocked in. But essentially, though, society kind of built up along. At first, yes, there was this kind of nervous energy, like, what is this thing? What is this, as Donald Trump called this invisible enemy? What is going on here? And it took some time for us to really go, okay, we've got to do something. We've got to mask up. We've got to shut down. We've got to social distance. We've got to just wait. But then at the same time, while most of the nation went, okay, we'll accept this. Remember, the Trump-Pence plan was 15 days. And then it became 30 days. And then it became based on medical recommendation. It became pretty much death. And then it took time for people to really kind of accept this air quote new normal. And so that is that kind of emotional response. There were some people at first who jumped right in. My wife jumped, she wore masks weeks before anybody made it mandatory. I was one of the ones who was like, who literally would tell her, I've never gotten sick going to fries, I'm not going to get sick now. All I had to do was go to California. And so it took time. The emotional response really got me and got people like me in a sense. So much like the States, there was that kind of hardcore, like that one group was like, okay, we're all in. and it took time for those to go, okay, we're in as well. And the argument it made was to push for secession was, if blacks are made equal to whites, then blacks will take jobs from whites. And blacks will be in your towns, in your churches, in your restaurants, stores. Blacks will kill you and take your women. These kinds of arguments were made by these secessionists and slave-owning supporters or slave owners. We're pushing for that secondary emotional jump. You know, just remember, if you don't wear a mask, you'll get sick and pass on the ground and shall die. If you don't socially distance, you're going to get sick and pass on the ground and die. Like, those are those kind of emotional responses. That's what we've got people falling across the line going, hey, I'll mask up, I'll social distance, I'll stay home, I'll, shut down, blah, 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 blah. That was kind of the thing that was going on here. If you don't, this will happen. Okay, I guess I have to, because that's the only thing that makes it now makes sense. That was all in at first, but now you're kind of making an argument that I can accept. So further, there were two truths. But on the Union side, there were two truths. One, secession was unconstitutional. As I said, there's nothing in the Constitution that says a state can secede. In fact, the Constitution literally says you're in perpetuity. In other words, you're in forever. But two was that if a state seceded, there was legally nothing the Union could do about it. Go ahead and swamp on there. Oh, okay, there we go. So this is a quote from the Articles of Confederation that the Supreme Court cited. Okay, so this is a quote in terms of secession was unconstitutional. By the Articles of Confederation, the Union was solemnly declared to, quote, be perpetual. And when these articles were found to be inadequate to the exigencies of the country, the Constitution was ordained, quote, to form a more perfect union. It is difficult to convey the idea of indissoluble unity more clearly than by those words. What can be indissoluble if a perpetual union, made more perfect, is not? So that is what the Supreme Court ruled in 1969 in regards to secession. The Articles of Confederation said that we're to be perpetual, and the Constitution says that it was designed to form a more perfect union. What can be more forever than that, as the Constitution said? So some of President James Buchanan's cabinet members were shifting munitions during this process that led up to two federal armories in the South. No southern states are going to secede. This was their way. This was the President of the United States. This is his staff's and his administration's way of helping the South get ready to secede, to fight against his own government that he's sworn to God to preserve. And on December 20th, 1860, South Carolina creates a secessionist convention and leaves the Union. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas would all leave by February of 1861. The Constitutional Convention was held in Montgomery, Alabama. They chose provisional offices. Jefferson Davis of Mississippi was the president, and Alexander Hamilton Stevens of Georgia was made vice president. The Confederate Constitution said, quote, each state acted in its sovereign and independent character. They explicitly guaranteed slavery in territory that the South would own, as well as the states. It forbade and protected the tariff. It outlined congressional appropriations for internal improvements, making all internal improvements state-based. It also gave the president a line-item veto, limiting the president to just 1 6-year term, which Mexico would eventually adopt based on the Confederate model. And it was designed to strengthen slavery as well as states' rights, weakening federal control. All right, what say you? These were all issues that the Confederate Constitution decided upon to essentially change the American Constitution, but for their will. If you can amend the United States Constitution today to include or remove federal or state-based powers, so think of powers that the federal government can or does have, which you included or discluded. Think of state powers that states can or do have, but would you include or get rid of them? What changes would you make and why? Socially distance stop your neighbors. Like I said, go.
Yeah, I would say. I don't know. I feel like,
Don't forget that you need to have your notes along with what say you participation notes. Remember that you have to write notes throughout the entire lecture as well. It's not just like one note. Oh, I watched. No, you have to take notes throughout the entire thing.
I noticed like that's basically I remember that.
I don't feel like that's something.
All right. You know, usually on the last day of in-person, the last day of the semester, I give everybody a stick and I let you break them because there is something very cathartic. It feels so good to shatter them. But I need these while we're on Zoom because otherwise I can't call it. And now I definitely do because we have 2 classes. So like, I'm really bummed I can't give you guys these. Maybe send me your address and a stamp and I'll mail it to you. And then just record a video of doing this, snapping it. I don't want to do it because then I would never call Andrew again. Andrew? Maybe I should snap. No, just in case. Jesse.
I personally think
Oh, what did you guys discuss?
like we kind of talked about like student loans, like state-based.
You had one about state laws?
Like we talked about like student loans.
Oh, student loans?
Yeah, like based on the state rather than
Oh, make loans be processed or offered through the states and not through the federal government?
Yeah.
That, I'd actually be really interested in looking at that. That might not be a bad idea from the perspective of competition. Some better interest rates and then cheaper tuition. Because I've mentioned this in the past, because the federal government is in the job of giving money for loans for school, they print the money. Therefore, they're going to pay out in terms of loans whatever it takes to get into a university. So what are universities going to do? They're going to charge more because it's the federal government who's essentially paying for it. And so they're good for the money. So let's just charge more and more and more and more and more. And so that inflation raises tuition rates. So if it's more competitive because you have 50 states offering loans, not to mention banks, that might lower a lot of things, especially in certain states. Maybe the state just says, well, we're not going to be in the business of offering loans. You got to go to a bank. And now those state universities don't have that kind of money, so they have to lower tuition. Now, people from out of state are going, well, it's cheaper to go to, so I'm thinking this all out live, live right now, but that actually would be unless I'm missing something in the process that really makes that a dumb idea. I don't think it's a dumb idea at all. I think it's a really good idea. Very good. Oh, just pictures. Oh. I like that. I like that a lot. Hannah.
Me and I were talking about I don't know how it's worked out, but having a American history curriculum that's the whole country follows the same U.S. history curriculum.
Oh.
Because that's an issue.
Yes, that's an issue.
A lot of it is very biased. And or like based on the states and stuff, and also like half of the American history curriculum across the country hasn't been revised since like the 90s. So if we just like had one.
Time ended, man. The 90s ended history. There's actually a very famous essay because with the fall of the Soviet Union, the essay was called History Has Ended, or The End of History. Because that was it. Now everything was going to be honey and milk and honey. Very interesting. Although the 10th Amendment, you got to get around the 10th Amendment because education is a state's thing. So, but that'd be a thing you could get rid of. I get you. Michael.
I don't know. I think that's kind of like hard to answer. It's because like stuff's changing all the time. Like the math stuff. Like federally, and that's where like now Arizona passed like a new math school.
No, the federal government never mandated masking. It would have had to have been a law that went through Congress, signed the president. That never happened. Masking is purely recommendation based alone. The only masking rule that I'm aware of is Biden signed an executive order that because he's in control of state parks, of federal, national parks, he signed an executive order like right after he took office that says you have to wear a mask on in national parks. There's nobody who enforced that though, so it's very much just and on federal property actually. Certainly at the park level, there's nobody to enforce that. But in terms of states, that is purely state-based. Look at Florida, Texas, Michigan, I believe as well. No masks. That's done. Arizona's coming very, very soon. So it's purely based on recommendation. Jake. No. I want to break. Taylor. Oh, there we go. Yeah, I was going to say it. Which one? We have two Tailies? Oh, yeah, I see what you're saying. I thought you said which one. I'm sorry. The masks do block. All right, well, let's just anybody have one if they want to just shout out? A change you would make? No? Just keep everything status quo. America's greatest, and this is perfect. Why change? Yeah.
You're talking about like changing the executive order powers. It's like the president's supposed to come in and sign off.
They act like mini dictators. Yeah. So I've used this phrase before. The office of president was designed as a lowercase k king. That was, the power of the president is that of a lowercase k king. But you're right, Nathaniel's right. In terms of executive orders, it's slowly becoming more and more uppercase k king, for sure. Yeah, those probably do need those do need to be reined in. So these are the states, the big 7 right here: Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, Florida. They were the first 7 to jump in. Then eventually Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia would enter. So let's see, these all seceded before the fall of Fort Sumter. These seceded after the fall of Fort Sumter. And then these were slave states right here: Mississippi, Kentucky, West Virginia, Delaware, and Maryland. But they being border states between the Union and the Confederacy, they remained loyal to the Union. So they would not secede, even though they were slave states. That would have been huge if they had seceded, because where is Washington, D.C.? Where is Lincoln's seat at this time? In Maryland. If Maryland had seceded, Virginia, so if you guys don't know, the White House, excuse me, not the White House, Washington, D.C., the location was decided upon by George Washington. And he wanted to kind of be fair. He didn't want to just, and basically the Constitution said that the nation's capital seats should be 100 square miles. So it was literally originally a square. But then Congress gave George Washington, the first president, the right. They gave him a big swath of land, huge swath of land, and said, choosing this area, but you get to pick the final resting spot. So to be fair, he placed it on 2 states. He placed it centrally down the line, basically down the line between Maryland and Virginia. So that way it wasn't just taking away 100 square miles from one state. It's like, okay, I'll take 50 and 50. Well, leading up to the war, Virginia demanded for their half back. They wanted their half back. And so Congress, to capitulate, was like, sure, okay, we'll give you your half back. So the southern half of Washington, D.C. was lobbed off at the Potomac. So to this day, because of the lead-up to the Civil War, even the Constitution says that the Washington, D.C. should be a 100 square mile block, it is now this sliver. It's just a kind of upper third, upper half of a square with a squiggle line on the Potomac River, because Virginia got their other half back. Well, now imagine if Maryland had seceded, now Washington, D.C., the American capital, would have been entirely in Confederate control. The whole White House, the whole Capitol, congressman, everybody would have had to have ran north and picked a new seat, probably in Philadelphia. But fortunately, because of these border states not seceding, it maintained the seat of the Capitol, maintained Lincoln in the White House, in the president in the White House. And there was fear, too. The Confederates tried to push into Maryland, because there's Virginia, and it's a border state, it's right there. There was fear that the Confederate armies could push into Washington, D.C. and try to shove Lincoln out. So he placed his most formidable army at the southern side of Washington, D.C. to protect D.C., to protect the White House. And nobody ever did make an incursion across the Potomac, but there was fear that they could. All right, so what was the response? President James Buchanan, lawful on the issue, leading up, he was the president before Lincoln. He had the power to prevent war, but instead chose to turn his back. Subject, because of this, and the subject is wildly subjective, he is now, James Buchanan, historically considered to be the worst president in American history because of this poor lead-up to the war. In fact, I gave you a link right here. This is, when I upload this live file, it's an active link. It's from U.S. News. They ranked the top 10 worst presidents in history, and he is, of course, ranked number 1. When pressed to turn on, and remember, his administration was sending Union armaments of guns, weapons, cannons, shoes, food, all these things to the South, specifically sending down the Southern force. So that when they seceded, they would have the weapons necessary to fight the very president who was sending them goods. So when pressed to turn over Fort Sumter to the Confederacy, a good Christian man as Buchanan was, quote, "You don't give me time to say my prayers. I always say my prayers when required to act upon any state affair." So he blamed God. That was his laziness and his willingness to just let Lincoln deal with Buchanan Roses. It was God's fault. He didn't answer quickly. So, of course, 8 states of slavery remained in Union until Fort Sumter, then the fort fell. They all had ties to the North. They feared battles would be fought in their states. They were less enamored with Southern propaganda. Slavery was not quite as entrenched in these states as it was in the Deep South. But eventually, again, for these 4, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, they would fall. Then Lincoln is elected. He's the first Republican in history, the first president, and the first party designed around getting rid of slavery. Republicans kind of waffled on the issue of the extension of slavery in territories, but Lincoln just, again, trying to figure out how do we prevent war. It wasn't like the war just started. They knew it was on the verge. They were literally counting down days. Is it going to start today? Is it going to start today? Let's give it a catalyst. And so Lincoln pushed them to stay the course, stop the spread of slavery. And he even worked on the crisis before taking office through public statements, correspondences, meaning letters, and even looking for Southern cabinet members to try to appease Southern cabinet members who would be anti-slavery. In his inaugural address, this is a picture from Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address right here. He even posed no threat to slavery, as a means of just saying, let's try to avoid war. and appealed to the South to return to the Union, and said he would preserve and protect the Union, and but still would retain federal installations in the South if necessary. Oh, I thought I made this picture bigger, but anyway, Lincoln is in this cabana right here, underneath here. In his first inaugural address, in this right here, he gave the greatest line, I think, in any presidential speech of all time. He said, quote, "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen," speaking of the South, "and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you." So here's Lincoln saying, "I will not throw the first punch. If you don't, I never will. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend." So on March 4th, 1861, he takes office and he says, "I will not throw the first punch. If you don't throw a punch, I will never fight. But if you throw that first punch, I will retaliate. My job is to protect this country. And if you are its enemy, I will fight for it." A couple weeks before, though, actually 3 months before, South Carolina was the first state to secede. And they said in their secession adoption paperwork, December 24th, 1860, quote, "We, therefore, the people of South Carolina, by our delegates and convention assembled, appealing to the supreme judge of the world, may God, for the rectitude of our intentions, have solemnly declared that the union heretofore existing between this state and the other states of North America is dissolved, and that the state of South Carolina has resumed her position among the nations of the world as a separate and independent state, with full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all the other acts and things which independent states may of right do." And then the gauntlet is thrown down. Fort Sumter is in Charleston Harbor and is one of the federal installations threatened by the Confederacy. Lincoln decides, and we're going to watch this 90-second video here in a second, but Lincoln decides to resupply it, not with weapons, but with food, clean water, and clothing. That's it. He's just going to show the South, I'm not going to pull these guys out. This harbor, even though it's in a Confederate state, a southern state, is of Union control. But I'm also not going to resupply them with weapons. I'm just going to get what they need to continue their tour of doom. So let's now watch this touch screen.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, sir. I'm the historian, and there are a few things we need to know that sound smart about Fort Sumter. We say on Fort Sumter.
Hold on, this is just way too bad.
Hi, my name is Matt Finster. I'm a historian, and here are a few things.
What did I touch?
Things you need to know that sound smart about Fort Sumter.
I'll forget it, I'm sorry.
Why? When we think of Fort Sumter, we think about the opening of the Civil War, the first shots fired. This is a fortification in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. And on April 12, 1861, the bombardment began. It did initiate a conflict between the Union and the Confederate States. But really, this story does begin with the secession crisis. Secession starts in December of 1860 in South Carolina. It's a response to Lincoln's election. The Republicans taking power scares a lot of the slaveholding interests in the South. Ultimately, 7 states will form the Confederacy in early 1861, and they will threaten federal fortifications in different harbors across the Atlantic coast and into the Gulf Coast. Harbors like Charleston, South Carolina, where there are federal fortifications and federal troops. Some say they can't hold the fort forts in the harbors, they should withdraw. Others say that they should resupply and re-provision the forts and try to launch an offensive. Then there's a middle way, an idea that perhaps if they offer humanitarian relief, offer provisions but not arms, they might be able to prevent the Confederates from firing on the fort, but still have symbolic hold of the fortification in the harbor. That's what Lincoln decides to do. He notifies the Confederate government, which he still doesn't recognize as legitimate, through back channels, and he plans to re-provision the fort with humanitarian supplies. Confederates decide they're not going to allow this to happen. They consider it an aggressive act against their sovereign claims. And so General Pierre Beauregard orders the surrender of the fort. Major Anderson declines to do so. On April 12th, Beauregard's forces begin a bombardment. It's going to last for about 34 hours. During that bombardment, both sides are firing away at each other. No one is killed. But clearly, Anderson and his men don't have enough provisions, supplies, or armaments to hold out against it. And so Anderson is forced to negotiate a surrender. The Confederates took control of Sumter, and this is what launches the American Civil War.
People in large numbers organizing. So where is Fort Sumter? So of course, this is South Carolina right here. Fort Sumter is in Charleston Harbor. Just continue to zoom in. So, and the point is that this is a major trading post, and so you have a fort in places like this to prevent from foreign invasion. It's the first line of defense in the event that the British, the French, the Spanish, anybody were to send an armada in to try to attack this harbor. So here's the harbor. Here's Charleston, South Carolina, right here. And here's the harbor. Here is the fort. It's this little tiny island, sticks up right at the mouth, right there. That's the fort. But again, in order to get into the harbor, you have to pass through here. So it's the first line of defense. And this is what Lincoln was rearming. So here's images. This is the fort. This is images of the fight. There are no pictures of the actual fight, but there is pictures of the aftermath. So this is an actual picture of the fort totally destroyed. Remember, nobody died in the fighting. Not one person on either side. They fight each other, like I said, 34 hours. Now this is after the fight, after it's been cleaned up, and after the Union soldiers had left. And this is now when the Confederacy raises their flag to denote this fort, this Confederate, is now held by the Confederacy. Okay, so not one person dies in the fight, but there was one death. So the first shots of the war between the states were fired at Fort Sumter in South Carolina's Charleston Harbor. Federal troops under the command of Major Roger Anderson surrendered to Confederate General Pierre Beauregard after an artillery bombardment that had begun on April 12th. So Beauregard, the Confederate general, was friend, and Anderson were friends. They had fought together in the Mexican-American War. They knew each other. They were very close. So what Anderson, the Union general, does, he says this letter and says, hey, can we do this honorably? Can I lower the flag? Can we get our guys out safely? And Beauregard said, sure, just leave, take the flag, do everything. Like, they even saluted, the Confederacy even saluted the Union soldiers because they were very much brothers. So no one was killed during the actual engagement. But as the Union soldiers lowered their flag, they honored it with a 100-gun salute. A premature discharge from one cannon caused an explosion that killed Private Daniel Hogue, who was 36 years old, of the 1st United States Artillery. Not technically a battle death, it did make Hogue the first person killed in the American Civil War. So that battle ended bloodless, but then in the salute, he dies because his cannon accidentally fires with him too close to it. So on April 12th, 1861, Fort Sumter is bombarded by Confederates, shore batteries, and eventually evacuated. 3 days later, Abraham Lincoln calls for volunteers to put down the insurrection. He now begins to call for volunteer men to join the army and really prepare to forward war. Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, North Carolina all then joined the Confederates. while Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, West Virginia remain as border states. All right. So now, what were the aims of both sides? Confederate aim was very simple: independence. They wanted out. Now, I want you to think of something that you probably hopefully never thought about before. If the United States had lost the American Revolution to the British from 76 to 83, would that war have been called the American Revolution? Why? Because there was no revolution. The revolutionaries lost. They all died. They were all hung. George Washington famously was hung outside his own home. That would have been called the American Civil War. If the revolutionaries had lost, that would have been known as the American Civil War. Why American Civil War? Well, A, it would have been, if we go through the definition, that would have been a civil war. Because more than 1,000 people died a year, and more than 5% on both sides. And one was against a central government, a central figure, that being the British. But had the British won, oh, and further, excuse me, I don't need to say the but the British won because I'm saying the British won. Further, they were called Americans. This was the North American continent. These were American colonists. They were part of the United States, but we are not, we are part of the United States of America. Well, these were British colonists of America, or in America. So that would have been known as the American Civil War. Instead, we win. Therefore, it's a revolution. It was a successful revolution. So now, the South wants independence. We look at this war in hindsight, with the Union winning, as the American Civil War, because the revolutionaries lost. But if the South had won independence, this war would have been known in our textbooks right now, would have been known as the Confederate Revolution. We were that close, although we were never really that close, but in technicalities, we were that close from the American Civil War being fought in the 1700s, and all using British accents to this day. And we were that close from the American Civil War, the 1860s, being eventually called the Confederate Revolution. So the primary problem is that the South did not have the manpower to defend its entire territory. They had to play a little defense. And passive defense was not their culture. They were very much an outgoing group. They wanted to go fight, and they wanted to go on the offensive and take territory. They just couldn't. And so as a political necessity, they forced them to concentrate their forces, which then eventually kind of would allow the Union armies, and in particular Grant, to get control, to be able to just wear them in. If the Confederacy could maintain itself on the battlefield, it could win the war in some ways, it could crush Union armies, which it potentially could have until Grant took power, and I'll explain why in a second. They could then potentially persuade European powers to recognize their independence, which never came. And let's say the French had recognized them, they'd sent in armies, boom, the United States were going to overrun the battlefield because they were not only Confederate armies, but the French armies, it's over. Or they could have frustrated Union offenses long enough to lead to northern war weariness, which would have just caused Lincoln to capitulate, to concede war, or concede loss to the Confederacy, or hope that he loses re-election to a Democrat who would do the same thing. And that didn't always happen. The Union main objectives was simply retain the Union. This is the initial objective, was to retain the Union. Just don't let the nation dissolve. For the Union to triumph, it had to meet several goals. Reunion, not abolition. Abolition had been a main message initially. But as the war got going, Lincoln saw the strategy and went, no, abolition, that's our goal. Boy, the Union soldiers jump on that. Two is keep Europe out. As I just explained, it'd be a lot more difficult to fight the Confederates and the French. So by keeping the Europeans out, all they have to do is focus on the Confederates and eventually they can pull it out. And three, Northern public opinion must continue to support war and not become so demoralized that secession becomes accepted. This is essentially what happened in Vietnam. The war lasted on, there were too many deaths, there was not a specific end goal in sight, and Americans got tired of it. We got kind of exhausted. Well, your parents or grandparents were kind of exhausted. So the United States was kind of forced to just be like, okay, this is just kind of a never-ending quagmire we're going to get out. strategies are very simple. Anybody remember the name of the Union's initial plan of Confederate defeat? What the initial strategy was? You guys totally learned this in I'm positive. It's in every textbook. What was the Union's initial strategy? It was named after an animal. No, not a turkey. No, not guerrilla warfare. That would be used by the Confederates in the end. What was this? There was a specific plan. It's named after a reptile in particular. It likes to squeeze its prey to death, lesson. Anaconda plant, very good. You guys remember this? Okay, so you guys have probably seen it's like a big snake. The objective was to circle the Confederacy, cut them off from the west, right here, cut them off from any shipping and trade with Europe, and slowly just squeeze them to death. This is the initial plan. So it was a blockade of southern ports, seizure and control of the Mississippi River, and then later an assault on Richmond, which is the Confederate capital. Winfield Scott right here is the initial strategist. He anticipated the evolutionary course of war, and thus the Union strategy evolved into something like this. It just took time. It took generals to actually act it out. Who would actually end up acting all this out? Who would take Mississippi? Grant. Who would cut them off in the north? Grant. Who would go after Richmond? Grant. You know, we just needed him. In the end, the Union strategy addressed both the will and the ability of white Southerners to persist. The Union victory can be attributed to good strategy, good command, solid home front, eventual emancipation, and total war. The United States became a total war nation. Everything citizens did was dedicated towards the war and keeping the soldiers well prepared, with enough food, good supplies, so on and so forth. All right, I'm going to shorten this a little bit, and we're going to skip this question. Just kind of think about this is an effective strategy. Okay. Can the strategy be used in other scenarios of life apart from war? That is like cutting off people. So we're going to shrink this just a little bit. So what was the rebel strategy? By the way, is this my food here? I smell like garlic.
Smells like something like
Or rice. Burning something. And it's like stuck in my mask. So I breathe in. It's just this. It smells like food, but it smells like garlic and rice and burnt rice. I know it. You're not allowed to hear it. I don't really wouldn't care. You're not allowed to use the mask. But that's what I'm like, hey, nice. So the South ended up waging a war of attrition. Their goal, Southern goal, ended up being wear the Union down. They kind of recognized they weren't able to outman and outgun the Union. Certainly knew they weren't able to outsupply the Union. So their thought was, if we just keep the war going, Northerners will just get exhausted and let us win. They'll just kind of let us go. Part of that strategy was to get from one full term of Lincoln's election and hope that he loses to a Democrat. And there was one very specific Democrat who, had he won, would have done that very thing. Like, okay, Slater, go, we're done, retired. We'll get into that next week. So a true strategic offensive would have has concentrated considerable federal force against one important center of the North, namely Washington, D.C. So the Confederate strategy of defense further proved to be their undoing. Though they were able to stave off defeat for a long time, the South never regained a significant amount of territory lost to the Union, and this whole idea of the anaconda really came to light. And again, it took Grant to do it, but once Grant did it, he just closed that noose around, closed that snake around, and just cut him off. So I've mentioned Grant. Let's look at who the main figures were. Robert Lee, of course, he was a model cadet at West Point, top of his class, and distinguished himself during the Mexican-American War. Harper's Ferry. He was a West Point commandant, which was a high-ranking official at the academy. It was the military school. So he was very, very bright, extremely smart when it came to military strategy. He resigned from the American Army and joined the Confederacy in 1860. He was actually asked by Lincoln first to head up the Union fight, and had he accepted it, the war's probably over in a couple of months. No exaggeration. But he was a Virginian, and he saw himself as a Virginian first. And with Virginia being one of those Confederate states, even though he was not himself a slave guy, he saw a loyalty to Virginia, and he believed enough that the federal government, the United States government, was oppressing just Southern kind of way of life, that he very, very politely turned down Lincoln's request and instead accepted Jefferson Davis's request to head up the Confederate Army. Had he taken the Union request, had he just said, no, I just can't, I really can't side with this Confederate movement, I will accept the Union. This war, you guys, could probably literally be months long. He was a gentleman officer, says, quote, duty is the sublimest word in our language. He was a gentleman of operations. His idea was to pin down the opponent, flank him, and attack, just get behind him, attack, just use the heck out of him. And he did it time and time again against the lesser American generals. Would never really get his way against Grant, but he would do it against many others. His primary commanders were Stonewall Jackson, Longstreet, Hill, Stuart. Not really important, but just so you know. His most important battles in the war were Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg. But basically, he was the general in charge of every major battle, truly major battle that the Confederacy fought. On the Union side, again, Lincoln asked him first. Had Lee accepted, the war's over. Instead, Lincoln has to try to fumble through a bunch of schmucks before he can finally find somebody who would fight. His Union general chiefs, so those generals who are in charge of the entire army, Lincoln has 4 of them. The Confederacy has 1. Lincoln goes to 4 of them. Winfield Scott starts out, barely makes it a few months, and just he can't do it. Then Lincoln turns to George McClellan. George McClellan's a young, cocky SOB, literally thinks he's God's gift to military strategy. He's the Democrat that eventually runs for president against Lincoln, gets just demolished. But is willing by the end of Lincoln's term to just concede everything to the Confederacy. Then when Lincoln fires McClellan for doing, McClellan was just sticking mud first. Brilliant as he thought he was, he never did anything actually brilliant. And he probably was very, very smart, but never actually did anything truly brilliant and was very inactive. And Lincoln fires him for that inactivity. Lincoln was just like, bloody fight, just fight, go fight, there's a fight, go fight. Do you see them? Go fight. McClellan will never do it. So Lincoln gets tipped off and fires him. Then he turns to Henry Halleck, who I teasingly said just before the photo snapped, he snapped and laughs. Lincoln seriously picked me. He gets fired for inactivity. And then Lincoln turns to the only general who actually fought. And Lincoln said, hey, would you go fight? And Grant said, I'll win. And he does. And General Grant, 4th general-in-chief Lincoln has to go through, fights. And he fights. And he fights. And he continues to fight. And he's called a butcher for the way he fights, but he fights and he wins. And Lincoln is like, praise the Lord, I have a fighter. Took 4 tries. So who was Grant? He graduated middle of the class at West Point. So whereas Lee was distinguished top of his class, Grant failed a bunch of classes and almost got kicked out. He excelled, however, in mathematics. He was mathematically brilliant, and he was a horse whisperer. He and horses had relationships with one another that were just uncanny. Another great American general president was the same way with Washington. Washington was a horse whisperer. Horses just loved him. He loved horses. He could train them. He rode them. Both Grant and Lincoln were very good on horses. They were equestrians. They entered competitions. They were both considered the best horse riders in the country at their time. Here they are, rising to the rank of the top general and presidents. So that was like his big kind of his true genius was his mathematics and his horse riding. He served in the Mexican-American War. However, outside of the military, where he did succeed, he basically failed in everything else. When the Civil War broke out, he was almost, he was this close to living on the streets. He, his wife, and his kids. He had no money. He was in constant debt. He was a tremendously honorable man. If he owed you a penny, he was going to pay you back, even if he couldn't buy food for his family, because he refused to be beholden to anybody. But he was in terrible debt, failed every business venture he could get into. When he retired initially from the army, well before the war, he had a decent rank, I forget what it was. And when the war broke out, he's like, well, this is my chance. I can make some money. I'm a soldier. So he contacted the Department of Defense, was like, hey, they were called Department of Defense, they called Department of War at the time. It's like, hey, I'd like to re-enlist. I'll take a lower position. I just need a job. And guess what the first answer was? Sorry, we don't have anything for you. So here is Ulysses S. Grant, practically living on the streets, begging for food, begging for a job in the middle of the war, and being told, we don't have anything for you. And this is the guy who would eventually win the war, president of the United States, and is still memorialized to this day on the field. This is how important he would eventually become. And when this war broke out, he was a nobody. Early actions were in the West report also that Grant issued an ultimatum, no terms but unconditional surrender. His name is not actually Ulysses S. There is no S in his name. His name is actually, do I have it on there? Oh, shoot. It's Hiram. His name is actually Hiram Ulysses Grant. There's no S in the name. What had happened was when he enlisted, somebody on those original documents made a mistake. And instead of saying Hiram Ulysses, wrote Ulysses S. And it stuck. And he's like, my name is not, I don't have an S in my name. Well, then, when he finally was given a position of general and he started to just kick freaking butt in the Western theater of the war, when he would win, he would say unconditional surrender. He would never offer terms that were favorable to the Confederacy. It was, you've lost, I take everything. Go home. And so he became known as Unconditional Surrender Grant. U.S. Grant. And the name stuck with it. But his name was actually Hiram. Which you never know. All because the document was just seriously, it was just a mistake on his initial military documents. So the home front, civilians experienced the Civil War in several different ways. Obviously, in the North, they experienced it for the first time in American history through photographs. This was the first war in human history to be photographed, documented on the field. In the South, it was fought on their home, in their backyards. Wives found themselves managing farms, plantations, and business affairs, and even entering the workforce to fill vacancies left by men went off to war. In many cases, the losses of husbands, fathers, and sons, sort of displacement of armies, moved through territories, stranded women in unfamiliar places with little means for support. And considering that with over 600,000 deaths in this war, over 3 million soldiers fighting throughout both the United States and the Confederacy, that was normal. So women were never trained, the economy wasn't set up for women to enter the workforce. Certainly outside of their farms. If they had a farm, plantation, they might work in that, but if the family didn't, the husband didn't, and granted that he had to work in industrial fields, then if the husband and sons were dead or out fighting, the women were really kind of like in awkward positions. I'm not used to this. All right, what say you? Is the draft fair? If the nation, the United States, goes to war and needs several million soldiers immediately, is it fair to draft men who do not openly enlist themselves? Take about 1 minute, social distance type neighbors. That's it. I'm waiting, so I was trying to entertain. So, give me a thumbs up if that was fun. Let's see how many people are actually watching. Just keep, oh, I got one. Hey, shoot me a text. Who is that? I love it. I was going to say I do get thumbs up on occasion, but I usually have to ask one. Literally, is there only one person watching? It says 8. It says 8, but how many of you guys actually just put it on and walk away? All right. We'll make this quick. Taylor, buy a lottery ticket. What did you guys say? Is the draft fair, yes or no? It's not fair, but it probably needs to happen as a necessity. Very good. Kenna?
We said something kind of similar to that, like there's a risk and reward, obviously.
Risk and reward.
Like,
Yeah.
would you rather not get enlisted and then your country loses?
Oh, you could have done something. Very good. Okay, so but you'd rather just stay out of it and your country loses, and you could have been one of the figures that could have helped win it. Very good. Julia? Michael? How did I picked all 3 of you guys already? That's great. Buy lottery tickets, all of you. Yes. Yeah. Oh, so if you have those kind of regulations, it's a little more fair. Gotcha. Okay, so if somebody's married with kids, you're not going to draft them. That kind of thing. Very good. So that means you gentlemen are all in that. You just enlisted Tyler. He's like, oh, I'm good. Hannah? What? Do I not know how to pull anybody else other than you 4? Like, how's it? No, yes. I mean, Leslie. Only if it's what? Oh, needed? Yeah. Okay, so not like, don't draft in the middle of peacetime kind of thing. Yeah. But if we're like desperate, do it. Very good. All right, so let's see, this is the end of the north. The Congress passed, Congress passed the Legal Tender Act, which issued $150 million in greenbacks, which is actually the start of the green kind of dollar movement to American currency. Now they're tending to have a lot more color. Dollar bill is kind of, it's what I've always seen it be since I was a child. It was not backed by silver or gold, only the credibility of the federal government. So this was the first time in American history we had fiat money. That is what we have now. It's not backed by anything tangible. And the promise the federal government says this dollar's worth a dollar. This is $50, it's worth $50. To which we ask, what is that? It's just worth it because I say it is. You just have to say, okay. And it says, this notice, the legal tender for all debts, public and private. It's just the federal government printing out money so that way people can still, the economy can still kind of push. This was currency during the American Civil War. This is northern currency during the Civil War. If you're able to find currency like this, it tends to be very expensive on the commodities market. In terms of taxing, Congress increased taxes across the board to be able to help afford and pay for the government, pay for the war. Conscription, which is the draft, was instituted to meet recruiting quotas. Draftees could evade being drafted go for $300, or they hired a substitute. So is that fair that you can evade being drafted if you paid the government $300, or if you were drafted, you found a substitute to go in your place? Is that fair? No? Why, Taylor?
It's because you're here for a reason. They need you. It's not like, oh, we stick to you because we want to.
You will pick for a reason because they need you. It's not just out of willy-nilly. Why else is that not fair?
It gives a partiality to the rich.
Yes.
You pay that and you got like 3 kids.
Yeah, it gives partiality to the rich. And back then, $300, that was a year's salary for a lot of people. $300, I mean, think about it. I mean, stuff we pay that's $2-3 now is a nickel or 2 cents kind of thing. So $300 went a long way back then. So if you had $300 in your account, that was potentially your life savings, and that could get you out of going to war. And then because of this, hundreds of poor immigrants who tend to be drafted couldn't get out of it. were killed during New York City draft riots between July 11th through the 16th, 1863. There were somewhere around 119, 120 deaths and 2,000 injuries. Many of these rioters went after Republican newspapers and blacks because they had better treatment from the federal government than these immigrants were. So here's some more draft. So that was one, the conscript bill, how to avoid the United States Navy. And here's volunteers wanted for artillery, infantry, cavalry, Mulligan's brigade, $402 bounty. That's an odd number, 402. Notice of drafting. So these are actual draft notices the federal government printed. Northern industry boomed as government contracts abounded. The government was paying people, and can you build tanks? Well, they didn't tanks. Can you build guns? Can you build cannons? Can you make shoes? Can you make suits? And they were, uniforms, that kind of thing. Just keep the army well funded and everything. So the economy boomed. The North's economic might concealed some weaknesses in leadership during the earlier conflict, i.e., these two schmucks, this guy in particular. The Confederacy took some more extreme measures, by the way, so these are actual Confederate dollars. Again, if you can find Confederate dollars in the trade market, on a collector's market, they tend to be very expensive. Well, I have a dream of owning some, I just don't have the money to own some. The Confederacy took some extreme measures to centralize this economic planning. Congress, the Confederate Congress was reluctant to raise taxes because remember, these were states. This is a Confederacy. It's not a union, a full federal union the way the United States is. These were states who were bound together to protect one another. So therefore, the federal government was made intentionally very weak. The Confederate Congress printed $500 million in paper money, causing massive inflation, which meant that they didn't have the kind of financial backing to be able to afford money they were printing. And policy, there was further a policy to impress the price of goods, keep the price low so that people could afford it, but it also meant because of inflation that the producers were selling the goods that people were buying weren't making nearly as much money. Oh, and this is an article on how the Confederacy made their currency. So again, when I upload this, that'll be added. The fiscal policy of the Confederacy cost them popular support. Confederate conscription, their own draft, and volunteers mobilized 80% of its available white manpower for military service because most of the labor force was slaves. In other words, if you were if you were between the age ultimately of 14 and 60, eventually, so they started on a minimal draft range. It was eventually applied to 14 to 60, or maybe 16 to 60. 80% of white men within that range were drafted in New York. 80%. They could do it because they had so many slaves. But that is a huge percentage of the white, population of any gender or group that was gone by high school. Republicans in the North rarely allowed differences to shape their political agenda. The South Confederate politics and society were shaped by the fundamental differences of this new nation. They didn't have a federal government to prosecute because they gave all power to the states. But just kind of find it, okay. We get through. All right, so we're going to hit the first battle we're after. Now, I want you guys to know right now that I do not care at all about military strategy. So I'm not going to bog you down in that kind of mundane worthlessness. It means literally nothing to your lives. The war means something. It changed the country forever in a very profound way. Battles, unless they played a specific role in setting something up politically or socially, like Antietam, which we'll get into next week, Antietam played in setting up emancipation, are worthless. So I'm not talking strategy. When I talk battles, I can give you what I call a tale of the tape. It's basically like who fought, what happened, and that's it. It's going to be very, very brief. So the first battle of Bull Run, which was the reason why it's important, though, is this was seen as potentially the end of the war. Both sides thought all we need is one big battle, knock the other guy out, and voila, it's over. This battle showed, though, that was not going to happen. So the first battle of Bull Run was on July 21st, 1861. We're coming up to 160-year anniversary right now here in a couple months. The principal commanders were General Irvin McDowell of the United States and Joseph Johnston and Pierre Beauregard of the Confederacy. Does not matter, I'm just kind of telling you, you're writing on stuff. This was the first major land battle in the armies in Virginia. Both sides thought this was the only major battle. And this thing would rage on for another 4.5 years. Untested Union Army marched from Washington, D.C. against the Confederates drawn up behind a creek. McDowell crossed at Sudley Ford and attacked the Confederate left flank, just means the left side, on Matthews Hill. Fighting raged through the day as Confederate forces were driven back to Henry Hill. Late in the afternoon, Confederate reinforcements, one brigade arriving by rail from the Shenandoah Valley, extended and broke the Union right flank. The Federals retreated, and the battle rapidly deteriorated into a Confederate rout, a big Confederate victory. Although victorious, though, Confederate forces were too disorganized to pursue. So here's a painting from that battle right here. This is a small portion of what it would have looked like. It's almost madness. It's just like insane. So this is where I just don't care. I show it to you so you have the information, but it's irrelevant. Those red squiggly lines are the Confederacy, the blue squiggly lines are the Union. They move, the arrows point to things, and then there are like X's and stuff, and that's where they play tic-tac-toe or something. And then there's a line, because they start, this is like the equal sign of some math equation. You guys, I just don't care. It's just not relevant. I'm teasing. This is what it looked like. If it matters to you, look it up. Otherwise, it means nothing to us. We talk about the politics and the social side. That's the important stuff. So the tale of tape, 35,000 soldiers were on the Union side, between 32 and 34,000 on the Confederate side. One important thing I want to point out. And that is how many people were left that never fought. 17,000 soldiers on both sides never saw the battle, but they were left what's known as reserve. In the event of emergency, any number of them could be sent in. This would be important in the future. Again, we'll get into this on Thursday of next week. This is why the Union could have won this war so many times early, because they outnumbered often the Confederacy by huge numbers. We're talking tens of thousands of soldiers more than the Confederacy had, that if they just threw them all on the battlefield, they would have overwhelmed the Confederacy and just destroyed their armies. But instead, one of the Union generals, all Union generals until Grand Duke, they held thousands of them in reserve, and then ended up losing or tying battles that should have been easy Union American victories. So keep these numbers in mind. They look big. These numbers are small compared to some of the battles we're about to get. But the numbers of guys who just hung around and didn't fight, that could have made all the difference in the world, that number is bigger and bigger as well. So total casualties in this first battle, 481 Americans were killed, 1,100 or 1,000 wounded, 1,200 missing, probably mostly deserters, but dead deserters. This is also the first war that human bodies just disappeared. And I'll share this very quickly. Cannons prior to the Civil War were just giant bullets. They were solid, heavy balls. And what would happen is if they went through, they were shot towards something, they would often bounce off the ground if they were shallow. So if they came to an animal and hit the ground, there'd be, an explosion of just dirt and, pressure combustion. It would cause damage and kill people. But if it was fired at a low angle, they could bounce off the surface and they would just bolt through, coming at, hundreds of miles an hour, just bolt through people. And every time someone just, they just go through the legs, rip them off. There are stories of the ball bouncing and going through a head. There's a headless body that just stands there for a moment before it just disappears. If it went through the gut, they would just fly out the back and start to grab and press it. That's what they did. By this time, though, cannons were made hollow. And then they were set with timing fuses that caused them to explode. And in that hollow chamber were smaller balls that then went out on the battlefield. So they're essentially gigantic, super deadly shotgun shells, if you will, that would be the size of a basketball. Now, imagine if the fuse detonated when it was next to someone, in flying, just by timing, just flew by me at the moment it exploded, I was happening next to it. My body exploded, or that body would explode into a shower of atoms. And that's literally how it's described. Where a human being once stood, nothing remained. So that person is definitely dead because their body does not, it almost incinerates instantly. but there's also no body, no pick up and identify. So these were part of those numbers. A lot of these missing were AWOLs. Some of them were dead, and their bodies were just not found and floated down rivers, and others literally disappeared from the surface of the earth. Casualties on the Confederate side were about 2,000, so they lost about 800 fewer people. It was the largest battle in American history. The date that would pale by comparison to the way about us. The day after the battle, Lincoln signed the bill calling for the enlistment of 500,000 more soldiers at 3 years' service. So all of a sudden, he knew this ain't over. Many had believed prior to the battle that one individual battle would win. They were led to understand this war would continue. All right, so Confederacy wins the first battle. Once again, let me take a time to read it. Once again, here's the assignment. 4 questions. What day is it due? The 13th, 2 weeks from today. You've got plenty of time. We can now answer number 1 completely. Because we no longer go into the causes of the American Civil War. We're now into the war itself. All right? Let me take time to look at it. Any questions, Councilor Church, or time before we go? No? All right. Amber, Andrew, Ashley, Avery, Brian, Brooklyn, Dawson, Demetrius, Erica, Emily, Frederick, Haley, Hannah, Isabella, Jamie, Janae, Jesse, Joella, John, Julia, Kenna, Carissa, Laurel, Lori, Leslie, Matthew, Michael, Nathaniel, Raina, Taylor, Tyler, Vanessa. No, Vanessa? It's been an amazing semester. I hope you all have a great week. See you on Zoom or on YouTube on Thursday, and see you on Zoom in person 1 week from today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, 3 thumbs up. Thank you.